everyone, it's attorney Asil Soccer here from Hess Law. I wanted to give you guys an update regarding the most recent proclamation that came out of the White House yesterday, and just explain to you guys what it means, who's going to be impacted by this suspension of issuing visas, who's exempt from it, and where there might be exceptions. And I'm gonna be logged in for a little bit, so if you have any questions, I really encourage you guys to go ahead and shoot me a message, and maybe I can try to answer your question as I go through what this latest proclamation was. So just to take it back a little bit, if you recall, back in April, actually April 22nd, there was a proclamation that banned the issuance of immigrant visas. And immigrant visas are essentially visas for foreign nationals who are currently abroad or overseas that would allow them to enter into the United States as legal permanent residents. And so for many people who were going through the green card process, but they were processing outside of the country or doing what we call consular processing, they were waiting to go to their interview at the embassy so that they could get their immigrant visa and come and enter the United States and become legal permanent residents. So back in April 22nd of this year, President Trump put a suspension on the issuance of all of those immigrant visas. There were certain exceptions for spouses of U.S. citizens and for children, minors of U.S. citizens. They were still going to allow those green cards to be processed. And then there were certain exceptions for investment-based visas. The EB-5 immigrant visa was an exception to that suspension, as well as anybody who was going to be coming into the United States in the capacity of working in the medical profession, because that was obviously something that we needed and we still do need right now. So there were certain exceptions given under those categories, but for the most part, anybody who had been going through the process to get their immigrant visa or their green card that didn't meet those exceptions was put on hold, which is tough for a lot of people, especially, let's say, siblings of U.S. citizens or parents of U.S. citizens who have been waiting years maybe to go through this process. That was put on hold. But if you recall, since March probably, most U.S. embassies around the world actually stopped conducting interviews. And so even though there was a suspension put on the immigrant visas, those embassies were not necessarily taking on the interviews to have people come in and continue processing their visas. So that was the first proclamation that came through on April 22nd. In addition to that, we had a couple of suspensions on travel from Europe because of their high levels of COVID-19, and then now from Brazil. Since then, those are still in place, those restrictions. But in addition to that, yesterday, June 22nd, there was an additional proclamation which expanded the suspension of visas, and now it expanded it to what we call non-immigrant visas, which are basically temporary visas in certain categories, okay? So for those of you who already have a visa in your passport, if you've already been issued a visa to enter the United States, this doesn't apply to you, okay? Unless, of course, you're coming from Brazil or you're coming from Europe, and then that ban is applied to you, but that's just because of COVID-19. The June 22nd proclamation was more of a way to protect U.S. and American workers, because the categories that were targeted in this proclamation were related to employment-based visas. And so those categories that are going to be suspended until December 31st are H-1Bs, which are for professionals, essentially, employment-based visas for professionals, H-2Bs, which are seasonal workers, J visas, which are typically those who are employed in some type of research capacity, and L visas, which are visas that are issued specifically for executives and managers of multinational corporations, okay? So those were what came out yesterday as being expanded in the suspension, and it's going to last until December 31st. We know that for sure. It could go on longer, but at least until December 31st. If you already have those visas in your passport, you're not affected. So this is just a suspension on the issuance of a new visa under those categories that I just mentioned, H-1B, H-2B, J, and L, okay? So if you already have that visa in your passport, it doesn't apply to you. If you're already in the United States and you are here under one of those categories or in that status, it also doesn't apply to you. However, if you have recently extended your status under one of those categories or changed to a status in that in one of those 4 categories, then you're kind of obligated to stay here in the United States, because if you leave, you're not going to be able to get that visa put into your passport, because the embassies are not permitted to issue those visas from now until at least December 31st, okay? So if you already have one of those visas, you're fine to re-enter. If you're here and you've just done an extension of your status or changed over to that status, but you don't actually have the visa, stay put. And if you're outside of the United States and you were in the midst of applying for a visa under one of those categories, just know that the embassy is not going to be able to issue you that visa anytime before December 31st. But as we all know, most of the embassies are closed anyways. We're not exactly sure when they're going to be reopening, aside from emergency appointments and emergency interviews. But for right now, they're not conducting interviews for, just general applications. And at the same time, even when they do open, you will not be able to receive, or they will not be able to issue a visa under the J category, L category, H-1B, or H-2B from now until December 31st. If you're a legal permanent resident, or if you're a U.S. citizen and you're abroad, obviously this doesn't apply to you. You are permitted to re-enter. Now, the June 22nd proclamation, even though it expanded the suspension of the non-immigrant visas, there are still a few exceptions. And so if you are an H-2B worker, like a seasonal worker, but your work is related to food chain, the supply chain of food, there are exceptions for that. So that might be applicable to you. There are also exceptions if the consular officer who interviews you finds that it's in the interest of national security that you actually are permitted to come to the United States, there might be an exception granted for you under one of those categories. So that's just like a basic rundown of what came out yesterday. And what came out yesterday also included in it a provision to extend the April 22nd proclamation, the one that banned the green card or the immigrant visas, up until December 31st. Okay, so we know that from now until that time, we're going to have a ban or a suspension of the issuance of visas for anybody who is outside the United States trying to apply for their green card, unless your spouse is a U.S. citizen or you're applying for your child under 21 and you were a U.S. citizen. Those people will be exceptions to that ban. Also, anyone who was applying for an immigrant visa under the EB-5 category, which is the investment category. Those of you who are in the medical profession, there were exemptions for that. And so they'll continue to process or issue your immigrant visas. Anyone else, that's just going to be put on hold, suspended until December 31st. And then again, just to reiterate, when we talk about the non-immigrant visas or the temporary visas for employment-based workers, we're talking about H-1B employees, H-2B, J, and L visas. So again, just to make sure you guys understand clearly that if you are under that status and you're currently in the United States, I highly recommend that you stay put. Don't travel unless you already have a valid visa inside of your U.S. passport that allows you multiple entry and it's not expired yet. If you're outside the United States and you kind of got caught in the midst of this process, then just know that the embassy is not going to be permitted to issue you a visa under those categories until after December 31st. at least. This suspension or this ban might get extended, but for right now, we know that it's valid at least until December 31st. So that's kind of a rundown of what happened yesterday in the proclamation that the White House released. But I did have a few questions from some of my clients. One of them in particular was somebody who was here. So a client asked me this morning, actually, he's here on an L1 visa. He and his family and his dependents are all here under the L category. And he recently got his L visa approved to be extended. And so that's great. He can stay here, and his status here was extended. But the question was, Asil, can I travel? Can I go back to, I think, Canada? And the answer is no, because once you travel, because he didn't have the visa in his passport, once he travels, he goes to Canada. If he wants to re-enter, it would require him to go to the U.S. Embassy and get a visa in his passport under the same L category, and that's just not going to happen from now until December 31st. So my advice to him, stay put at least until December 31st when we know that they're going to lift the suspension. Until that time, you don't want to take a chance and travel and then not be permitted to re-enter. So that was the common question that I had that I wanted to address. Just going to bring this closer, because I know I had some other questions that came up today. So there's another visa category called the TN visas. If you're familiar with it, it is also for professionals, but it is specifically given to Canadian and Mexican nationals. It's an agreement that the United States has with Canada and Mexico. It allows for ease of employment between Canadians and Mexicans in the United States. Also in the professional categories, it's an employment-based type visa, a non-immigrant visa. That category, thankfully, was not affected. So if you have a TN, or if you're in the process of applying for a TN, the embassy, when they open, will be able to issue that category of visa. So you don't need to worry about that if you were in the process of getting a TN, or if you were a dependent of somebody getting a TN. That's still going to be processed, but just please note, a separate and aside from these proclamations that the White House released, embassies are just not open for interviews right now. And that's just because of the threat of infection and them trying to avoid too much personal or social interaction. But once those visas open, the TN visas will be available and issued. They're not part of the ban. I have a client who's under an O visa, and he was asking me about that. O visas are fine, even though they're employment-based and they are non-immigrant or temporary visas. Those have not been impacted. So that was a question that came up. So for those of you who are going through the PERM process or the labor certification process and you're abroad, it means you're applying for a green card based on employment. You have an employee, a U.S. employer here in the United States who's sponsoring you, and you are going through the process. Your application is still going to go through the system of going through the Department of Labor, and we can continue to proceed forward with your application with immigration. However, when we get to the stage of when you're actually supposed to get that immigrant visa and go to your interview at the embassy, if that interview is from now until December 31st, the embassy's not going to be able to issue you that immigrant visa, unless, of course, you fit under one of the exceptions that we were talking about, where you might be a healthcare provider in the medical profession, or your services that you offer, your profession is within the national interest of the United States for us to have you here. But you would have to kind of make that argument to the consular officer who's interviewing you. So that was another concern that people were having, because it is such a lengthy process. And if they were overseas, or they were about to go in for their interviews, or they were expecting to go into their interviews maybe later this fall before the end of the year, that's just gonna be put on pause. We'll see if they extend this suspension of immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas past December 31st, but for right now, again, the proclamation that came out yesterday just went ahead and extended the suspension of both non-immigrant visas in those 4 categories I said. I'll repeat it again. You guys are gonna have this stuck in your head. That's H-1Bs, those are for professionals. H-2Bs are for seasonal workers. Js, usually in a research type profession, and Ls, who are managers and executives of multinational companies. And so that again got extended, or it got included in the suspension of issuance of visas until December 31st, along with the immigrant visas, which are for people who were going through the green card process, but they were doing consular processing, or they were waiting to go through an embassy or a consulate interview in order to get their immigrant visas, which would allow them to come here as green card holders. Those are put on hold, except for anyone who is married to a U.S. citizen, or they are the child of a U.S. citizen. They are applying for the green card under the EB-5 category, which is the investment-based category, or again, they are in some type of medical profession or some type of profession that's in the national interest of the United States. So that's kind of the rundown there of what's included, what's excluded, what you might be able to qualify for under an exception, and keep the process moving along, and hopefully still be able to get your visas at the embassy. Again, the embassies are just closed in general. They might reopen early August. We're still not sure. They might open kind of on a case-by-case basis, depending on the infection level of the country that they're in. For right now, there are certain appointments available under kind of emergency situations. I do want to touch on the fact that, again, if you already have that visa in your passport, this doesn't affect you. If you're a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen and you're abroad, it doesn't affect you. If you were applying or in the process of applying for just a regular tourist visa or a student visa, we call the visitor visa, the B1, B2, or the student visa, under the F1 categories, once the embassies open, they will still be able to issue you a visa. Those are not included in the most recent suspension of visas. So those are not affected. And a lot of people were asking me that, like, oh, if I'm just want to get a visitor visa, or I was trying to come to school in the United States and I wanted to get an F1, would that be on hold? The answer is no, those are not included. Again, when the embassies open again, they will be issuing those type of visas. So far that we haven't heard differently. So that's kind of the rundown there. I just want to check in and see if any questions have come up on the little chat. I'll stick around for a little bit more just to see if you guys want to shoot me a message. I'll try to answer your thing in the comments. Okay. All right, well, I know this was like a lot of information for you guys to take in. Remember, this is kind of, it seems like there's almost a new announcement related to immigration on a monthly basis, if not on a weekly basis. So I know it's a lot of information to take in. If you feel like you're kind of confused or lost, or you or a family member or maybe one of your employees kind of got stuck in the middle of this, they're abroad right now, you're not sure if they're going to be able to come back, give us a call. The phone number at the office is 281-205-8540. Shoot us a message on Facebook. We'll be able to quickly get your contact information and get back to you and get you an answer. If you feel like you have a bigger issue or something not even related to these travel or these visa suspensions, still give us a call, set up a consultation. The phone number is 281-205-8540. We're here to help. We're here to, walk it through with you and explain what's going on, how you might be impacted. And until then, I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to hear from you soon. Have a good night.